Chapter 1. Christmas Night, 1945. George Sodder would never forget the sound of his wife screaming their children's names into the flames. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Her voice broke on each name, turning from panic into something raw and animal. The only answer was the roar of fire consuming their two-story home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. It was 12:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, 1945. 5 of their children were trapped on the second floor, and George already knew, with a cold certainty in his chest, that this was no ordinary house fire. The smell of smoke. Jenny Sodder woke up not to a sound, but to a smell. Acrid, chemical, wrong. She inhaled and her lungs filled with smoke. For a few seconds her mind refused to understand. Then she heard it. The crackling, the hissing, the hungry sound of fire moving fast. "George! George!" She shook her husband hard. George bolted upright. Flames were already crawling up the walls downstairs, orange light flickering near the electrical fuse box. The smoke was thick and black, pouring up the staircase like a living thing. This was not how a small accidental fire behaved. This was already an inferno. They had minutes, maybe less. The escape that wasn't chaos followed, screaming, coughing, running in circles through the dark. George grabbed the youngest children sleeping on the first floor. Jenny pounded on doors, shouting, dragging half-awake kids into the freezing night. Marion made it out. The older boys smashed through windows, cutting themselves on glass, stumbling into the yard in bare feet and pajamas. When George finally counted, 7 children stood shivering in the December cold, staring at the burning house. But 5 were still inside, on the second floor, where the flames were thickest. George could see their bedroom windows, black rectangles against the orange glow. No faces pressed to the glass, no hands, no silhouettes, no screams. It was as if the children had simply vanished. The missing ladder, the ladder. The thought hit him like a slap. There was always a ladder propped against the side of the house. He used it constantly for repairs. He ran around the house, feet crunching on frost. The ladder was gone. Not fallen, not buried. Gone. Panic rising, he sprinted to his coal trucks. If he could move a truck close to the house, he could climb onto the roof, break the bedroom windows, drag the children out. He yanked open the door of the first truck, turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. He tried again. Nothing. The second truck. Same thing. Dead. Both trucks had worked perfectly the day before. George's hands were shaking now, not from the cold, but from the growing realization that something was very wrong. The call that never came. A neighbor, jolted awake by the shouting, ran to call the fire department. She lifted the receiver. No dial tone. The line was dead. She ran to another house. Their phone worked. The call finally went through around 1 a.m. The fire station was only a few miles away. 10 minutes, maybe less, under normal conditions. The fire trucks arrived at 8 a.m. By then, the Sodder home was a smoking crater. For 7 hours, George and Jenny had stood in the frozen darkness, watching their house collapse in on itself, watching the fire die down, watching their hope burn out with it. The fire chief stepped out of the truck with a casualness that made George's stomach turn. He glanced over the ruins, shrugged, and offered an explanation. The trucks wouldn't start. Cold weather. It had been about 42 degrees. What should have been there? When the sun rose on Christmas morning, George started digging through the wreckage with his bare hands. He ignored the heat still radiating from the ashes. Charred beams burned his palms. He didn't stop. He was searching for what should have been there. Bones, skulls, teeth, something, anything. He found nothing. Investigators spent hours combing through the remains of the house. Their official conclusion was simple. No human remains discovered. The fire chief had a ready answer. The fire, he said, had burned so hot and so long that it had completely cremated the children's bodies, reducing them to ash. George Sodder had spent his life working with coal and fire. He knew how hot a house fire could get. He also knew what the chief was claiming was impossible. In real fires, even the worst ones, something always survives, especially teeth. When George tried to argue, the chief turned away. The explanation was given. The story, as far as the authorities were concerned, was finished. Burial without bodies. 2 days after the fire, the county coroner arrived. He stayed less than 2 hours. No photographs, no samples, no real forensic work. Then he issued 5 death certificates. Cause of death for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Fire or suffocation. There were no bodies, no bones, no physical evidence that 5 children had died in that house. But on paper, the case was closed. Soon after, county workers brought in bulldozers. They pushed 5 feet of dirt over the ruins, packing it down hard. Officially, it was for the family's closure. To George, it felt like something else entirely. The destruction of a crime scene. Within hours, any chance at a proper investigation was buried. The decision. That Christmas, as 1945 turned into 1946, George and Jenny Sodder made a choice. They refused to accept that their children had died in that fire. Not with no bodies. Not with missing ladders, dead trucks, and a fire department that took 7 hours to arrive. In their minds, another story made far more sense, and hurt far more deeply. Someone had taken their children. Someone had set the fire not to kill them, but to erase the evidence of a kidnapping. What George and Jenny didn't yet know was that this was only the beginning. Witnesses would come forward. Strange clues would surface. And the more they dug into that Christmas night, the clearer one thing would become. The fire that destroyed their home wasn't just a tragedy. It was the opening move in something far darker, something that would consume the rest of their lives. Chapter 2. The clues that don't add up. 3 weeks after the fire, a phone call arrived that made Jenny Sodder's hands shake so badly she nearly dropped the receiver. A hotel clerk from Charleston, West Virginia, 50 miles from Fayetteville, had information. She'd seen the children. 4 of them, maybe 5. They were sitting in the hotel restaurant on the morning of December 27th, just 2 days after the fire. The children looked scared, the woman said, her voice low, as if someone might be listening. They weren't talking. 2 women and 2 men were with them, watching them closely. One of the little girls, she looked exactly like the photograph in the newspaper. Same face, same age. When I tried to walk toward their table, the whole group stood up and left. They didn't even finish their breakfast. Jenny pressed the phone so hard against her ear it hurt. Are you certain? Are you absolutely certain it was them? Ma'am, the clerk said quietly, I have children of my own. I know what a scared child looks like. By the time George drove to Charleston, the group had checked out. No forwarding address. The name in the hotel register turned out to be fake. The clerk gave detailed descriptions, but nothing concrete enough to track anyone down. George sat in his truck outside the hotel for nearly an hour, gripping the steering wheel, unable to drive home. His children had been alive 2 days after the fire, and he'd been too late to save them. The man who predicted the fire. George began retracing the weeks before Christmas, searching his memory for anything unusual. One conversation kept surfacing like a bad dream. Late October, 1945. A man had knocked on the door, selling life insurance. George had politely declined. They already had coverage. They couldn't afford more. The man's expression changed instantly. The sales pitch vanished. He looked at the house, at the wooden frame, at the children playing in the yard, and then back at George with eyes that had gone flat and cold. Your house is going up in smoke, he said slowly, deliberately, and your children are going to destroy you. At the time, George had dismissed it as the bitter ranting of a rejected salesman. Now, those words felt like a death threat he'd been too naive to recognize. In January 1946, George tracked the man down. When confronted, the insurance salesman claimed no memory of making threats. But other people remembered. Witnesses confirmed George's account. More than that, they'd seen the man near the Sodder property multiple times in November and December. Watching. Waiting. George brought this information to the police. They wrote it down, nodded politely, and did nothing. The coroner had already ruled the deaths accidental. The case, as far as local authorities were concerned, was closed. What did it matter what some insurance salesman had said 2 months earlier? "My children are alive," George told the police chief, his voice breaking. "Someone threatened me, cut my phone lines, sabotaged my trucks, and took my children." The police chief looked at him with something close to pity. "Mr. Sodder, you need to let them rest in peace." "They're not dead," George shouted. "They're not at peace. They're out there somewhere, and you won't help me find them." He was escorted out of the station. The bones that weren't in the spring of 1946, George hired a private cremation expert from St. Louis. By that point, the fire site was buried under 5 feet of compacted earth, but George paid to have it excavated. They spent 2 weeks sifting through every fragment of debris. The expert's findings were unequivocal. For 5 children to be completely cremated by a residential house fire wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. The temperatures required, the duration needed, the controlled conditions, none had been present. In any fatal house fire, human remains always survive. Always. Teeth, especially, are incredibly resistant to heat. Even in industrial crematoriums, teeth remain largely intact. The Sodder fire site contained no teeth, no bone fragments, no human remains of any kind. But they did find something. Buried deep in the ashes, in an area that corresponded to where the children's bedrooms had been, the expert discovered what appeared to be bone fragments. 2 femurs, part of a spine, and several smaller pieces. Finally, George thought. Finally, proof. Even if it meant accepting the worst, at least they would know for certain. The expert examined the bones under magnification. Then he looked up at George with an expression of confusion and disgust. "These aren't children's bones," he said quietly. "They're adult remains, and they weren't burned in your fire. Someone planted them here." The world tilted beneath George's feet. Someone had gone to extraordinary effort, digging up adult bones from a cemetery or burial site, transporting them, hiding them in the ruins of his home, all to fool him, to make him stop searching, to make him believe his children were dead, which meant someone knew they were alive. George sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution for independent analysis. The report came back weeks later, definitive and damning. Adult remains, no evidence of fire damage, likely buried elsewhere, and then relocated to the Sodder site. Jenny read the report 3 times, her hands trembling. "Why would someone do this?" she whispered. "Why go to such lengths?" George had no answer, but the question terrified him. Whoever had taken their children wasn't some opportunistic criminal. They were methodical, patient, sophisticated enough to fool investigators and manipulate physical evidence. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was something planned, something organized. The sightings, the hotel clerk in Charleston wasn't the only one. A woman in Ohio reported seeing Martha and Betty at a highway rest stop in early 1946. A truck driver claimed he'd given a ride to a boy matching Maurice's description near the Kentucky border. A family in Pennsylvania swore they'd seen Lewis at a Sunday church service, but when they tried to verify, the family he was with had moved away overnight. Each lead evaporated under investigation, but there were so many of them. Too many to be coincidence. Too many to be mass delusion. George and Jenny began spending money they didn't have. They hired private investigators. They traveled hundreds of miles chasing tips. They placed advertisements in newspapers across 5 states, begging for information. Nothing worked. Every trail went cold within days. A billboard on the highway. In 1947, George and Jenny made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They purchased a massive billboard on Route 16, the main highway running through Fayetteville. It was impossible to miss. Huge photographs of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty staring down at every driver who passed. The text was simple and direct. 5 children missing in fire on Christmas Eve, 1945. $5,000 reward for information. The billboard stayed up for 23 years. It became a local landmark. Drivers passing through couldn't avoid those 5 young faces, frozen in time, never aging, never found. Neighbors told George and Jenny to take it down. It was morbid. It was disturbing. It was time to move on. Jenny's response was sharp. When your children are stolen, then you can tell me when it's time to move on. The billboard stayed. Strange leads and dead ends. The billboard generated hundreds of tips. Most were worthless. Some were cruel hoaxes, people pretending to be the missing children, demanding money, then vanishing when George asked for proof. But a few tips were disturbing in their specificity. In 1949, a woman from Florida wrote about 4 children she'd seen at a facility in St. Petersburg in early 1946. The descriptions matched the Sodder children almost exactly. The teenage boy told me his name was Morris, she wrote, but a staff member slapped him and said he didn't have a name anymore. George and Jenny traveled to Florida immediately. They spent 2 months investigating. The facility confirmed that 4 unregistered children had been there briefly in 1946, but all records had been routinely destroyed. No one would say where the children had come from or where they'd gone. Another dead end. The cover-up. What haunted George almost as much as losing his children was the behavior of local authorities. From the very beginning, there had been a rush to close the case. The coroner had issued death certificates without bodies. The fire site had been bulldozed within days. Police showed zero interest in investigating the sabotage evidence, the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks. In 1952, George discovered something that made his blood run cold. The fire chief who had arrived 7 hours late on Christmas morning, the man who claimed his trucks wouldn't start in cold weather, had served on the jury that approved demolishing the Sodder fire site. He had actively voted to bury the evidence before a proper investigation could occur. When George confronted him, the fire chief's response was chilling. "Those children are dead, Mr. Sodder. You need to accept that and move on. Stop making trouble for this community." Making trouble. By searching for his children. George began to understand. Local officials either knew what had happened and were covering it up, or they were being paid to ensure the investigation went nowhere. Every document he requested was lost. Every witness suddenly couldn't remember details. Every lead hit a wall of bureaucratic silence. Someone powerful wanted this case to stay closed. The weight of years. By 1955, 10 years after the fire, the Sodders had spent over $50,000 on their investigation, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. They had interviewed hundreds of people, traveled thousands of miles, followed every lead, no matter how unlikely, and they were no closer to finding their children than they had been on Christmas morning, 1945. There were nights when Jenny lay awake wondering if grief had made them see conspiracies where there were only coincidences. If they were clinging to impossible hope because the truth, that their children had burned alive, was too unbearable to accept. But then she'd remember the hotel clerk's voice. "I know what a scared child looks like." She'd remember the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the planted bones, the fire chief who took 7 hours to arrive. No, their children hadn't died in that fire. Someone had taken them, and whoever it was had covered their tracks with terrifying efficiency. The question that kept Jenny awake wasn't whether her children were alive. It was whether she'd ever see them again. Chapter 3. The photograph from 1968. The plain manila envelope arrived in early 1968, postmarked from Kentucky. No return address, no letter. Just a photograph and a cryptic note written in careful block letters. Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, Ill Boys. A 90132 or 35-inch Jenny Sodder's hands trembled as she held the photograph to the light. The young man in the picture was in his 30s, dark hair combed back, strong jaw, serious expression. And those eyes, deep-set, dark, unmistakably Sodder eyes. She had memorized her children's faces for 23 years. She knew every curve, every angle, every detail. And she knew, instantly and without doubt, this was Louis. Her 9-year-old boy, now a grown man. George took the photograph from her shaking fingers. He studied it in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. It's him. 23 years after the fire, someone had just confirmed what they'd believed all along. Their children were alive. But why send this now? And what did the message mean? The cryptic message. George and Jenny pored over every detail for weeks. I love Brother Frankie. There was no Frankie in the Sodder family. Was it a code? A fake name Louis had been forced to adopt? Ill Boys. An institution. A place. A deliberate misspelling to avoid detection. A 90132 or 35. Military identification number. Prison inmate number. An address. George drove to the Kentucky post office immediately. Postal workers claimed no memory of who had sent the envelope. He hired handwriting experts to analyze the block letters. Their conclusion, deliberately disguised, could be Louis himself trying to send a covert message, could be his captors taunting the Sodders. The photograph itself offered more questions than answers. Louis was indoors, standing against a plain wall, professional quality. He wore a formal suit and tie, but his expression wasn't a smile. It was haunted, resigned, like a man posing for a police mugshot or institutional identification photo. Jenny couldn't stop staring at his eyes. He looks trapped, she whispered, like he wants to come home but can't. The detective who quit George hired C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator with decades of experience and connections across multiple states. Tinsley spent 6 months chasing leads, military records, prison files, psychiatric institutions, children's homes across Kentucky and 5 surrounding states. Nothing. No Louis Sodder. No matching descriptions. The man in the photograph had vanished. Then, in Lexington, Kentucky, something happened that changed everything. A man approached Tinsley outside a diner. Middle-aged, nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. I know who took the Sodder kids, he said quietly. I know where they are. $10,000, and I'll tell you everything. Tinsley arranged to meet him the next day at a public location. The man never showed. 2 days later, Tinsley's hotel phone rang at 2:17 a.m. He answered groggily. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost polite. Stop asking about the Sodder children. Go home. If you don't, you'll disappear just like they did. The line went dead. Tinsley had investigated organized crime. He'd dealt with killers, con artists, dangerous people. But this voice terrified him in a way nothing else had. Too controlled, too certain, too calm. He quit the case the next day, returned George's money, never fully explained why. But George saw something in the investigator's eyes he'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Whoever had taken the Sodder children could reach anyone, anywhere, and they were still watching. The Mussolini connection, George's theory, which had seemed almost paranoid in the beginning, now carried new weight. During World War II, George had been outspoken against Mussolini within the Italian-American community in West Virginia. He'd refused to contribute funds to support fascist Italy. He'd argued publicly with men who believed Il Duce was a hero, and he'd received threats. Your family will pay for your disloyalty, one man had told him in 1943. Several of those men had vanished from West Virginia shortly after the fire. One, the insurance salesman who had predicted the house would go up in smoke, had known connections to organized crime networks in New York. Another had moved to Florida in early 1946, Around the same time, 4 children matching the Sodder's descriptions appeared at that mysterious facility in St. Petersburg. In 1972, George took his theory and all his evidence to the FBI. They reviewed the case for months. Then they quietly closed it with the same conclusion they'd reached before. No evidence of kidnapping, no evidence of criminal conspiracy. But they couldn't explain the photograph. They couldn't explain the threats against the private investigator. They ignored evidence that didn't fit their preferred narrative. George began to suspect the FBI knew more than they were saying. Much more. And for reasons he couldn't understand, they wanted him to stop asking questions. The fading billboard. By 1975, the Route 16 billboard was falling apart. 30 years of sun, rain, and wind had faded the photographs almost beyond recognition. Paint peeled, wood splintered. Neighbors and local officials demanded it come down. It upset tourists, they said. It frightened children. Jenny drove past it every day on her way to her factory job. Every single day, she'd whisper to the faded faces, "Mama's still looking." That same year, Jenny suffered a heart attack. In the hospital, recovering, she asked George the question that haunted them both. "Do you think they're still alive?" George, now 73 and exhausted, squeezed her hand. "Yes, and they know we never stopped." Jenny recovered, but her health never fully returned. The endless search, the hope, the dead ends, the threats, the decades of not knowing, was slowly killing her. George's death. George Sodder died in November 1969, 1 year after the photograph arrived. The official cause was heart failure. The real cause was 30 years of broken hope. His funeral drew hundreds of people, neighbors who'd watched the family's crusade for decades, strangers moved by the billboard, reporters who'd followed the case since 1945. Everyone understood. George Sodder had died still believing his children were alive. Jenny vowed to continue the search alone. But at 70 years old, with heart problems and no money left for private investigators, the trail grew colder. Tips dried up. Leads vanished. The billboard stood, fading, rotting, defiant. The question that broke Jenny. Late at night, alone in the house where most of her children had once lived, Jenny would stare at the photograph of Louis. And the question that tortured her wasn't, "Are they alive?" It was worse. If Louis was alive in 1968, 45 years after the fire, why didn't he come home? Had he been threatened, brainwashed, kept under constant surveillance? Was he being watched even now, decades later, unable to escape whoever controlled him? Or was the photograph itself a final, cruel hoax? One last way to break their hearts by proving their children had survived, but would never return. Jenny never found answers, but she never stopped believing. One mystery haunted her most. Whoever sent that photograph in 1968 knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it would rekindle hope. They knew it would tear George and Jenny apart all over again. And they sent it anyway. Someone was still playing with the Sodders, still watching, still in control. And after more than 2 decades of silence, they weren't finished yet. Chapter 4. Theories and Unanswered Questions. Jenny Sodder lived another 20 years after George's death, carrying the weight of their search alone. By the 1980s, she was in her late 80s, frail, slow, but still unwilling to let go of the mystery that had defined her life. The Route 16 billboard, now more than 3 decades old, had become a decaying landmark. The once sharp faces of the children were almost ghosts, bleached by sun, scarred by rain, eaten away by time. When local officials finally ordered it torn down in 1989, for safety reasons, Jenny took the news as a personal betrayal. "I took down their pictures," she told her daughter Sylvia, weeping. "I abandoned them." Weeks later, Jenny died at the age of 90. She had spent 44 years, over half her life, searching for answers she never found. Her final request was simple and heartbreaking: to be buried facing east, toward the highway where the billboard had stood. so that in some impossible way she could still be watching for them. What the surviving children believed. The 7 Sodder children who survived the fire grew up under the long shadow of that night. Each carried their own version of the story. Marion, the eldest daughter, never doubted the kidnapping theory. No bodies, no death, she would say. For her, the lack of remains ended the argument. John, who had broken through a window that Christmas night and watched the house burn from the yard, funded private investigators well into the 1970s. Every time a new rumor surfaced, another sighting, another whispered confession, he was the one who pushed to investigate. Sylvia, the youngest of the survivors and a baby during the fire, became the family archivist. She collected everything: photographs, letters, official documents, witness statements, newspaper clippings. Decades later, as an old woman, she would still tell reporters, "My parents were right. Someone took them." And yet, even inside the family, doubt lingered. Some wondered if their grief-stricken parents had clung too hard to impossible hope. Maybe the fire had been exactly what the authorities said: a tragedy, nothing more. Maybe the sightings were mistaken identity, the photograph a cruel prank, the planted bones a bizarre but unrelated act. But even the most skeptical siblings struggled to explain certain facts. The cut phone lines, the missing ladder, found far from the house days later, the trucks that mysteriously failed only on that one night, the adult bones hidden in the ruins, never burned at all. Whatever the truth was, one thing united them. Somewhere, someone knew exactly what had happened, and that person, witness, accomplice, or official, had chosen silence. Theory 1. Italian mob revenge. The theory George clung to the most was born out of his own past. During World War II, in the tight-knit Italian-American community of West Virginia, George had been vocal, almost reckless, in his hatred of Mussolini. He refused to donate to pro-fascist causes, argued loudly in public, and made enemies among men who still idolized the dictator. Threats followed. "Your sons will pay for your disloyalty," one man warned in 1943. In the years after the fire, a pattern emerged. Several of the most outspoken Mussolini supporters from the area disappeared from West Virginia. One of them was the same insurance salesman who had predicted that George's house would go up in smoke and his children would destroy him. Another resurfaced in Florida, not far from the mysterious facility where 4 unregistered children had allegedly appeared in 1946. Under this theory, the fire wasn't random at all. It was a message, punishment for defiance. The children removed as leverage or revenge, then placed with sympathetic families or criminal networks linked to the Italian mob. Was it plausible? Yes. Mid-20th century organized crime certainly had the resources to plan such an operation, to arrange transport, even to manipulate local officials. But hard proof never surfaced. It remains a chilling possibility, not a solved puzzle. Theory 2. Human trafficking. Another, darker theory looks beyond politics. In the 1930s to 1950s, the United States had a shadow market for children. Orphans could be quietly placed with families willing to pay, especially if they were young, healthy, and white. Paperwork could be altered or destroyed. Identities could vanish. Under this theory, the Sodder children were targeted not because of George's politics, but because they were valuable. 5 siblings, close in age, taken in one coordinated event that could be framed as a tragic fire. The blaze erased witnesses, confused timelines, and gave kidnappers hours of cover before any serious investigation began. The scattered sightings support this idea. Children who looked like the Sodders, traveling with watchful adults. The Florida facility that briefly housed 4 unregistered kids, whose descriptions matched almost perfectly. The professional-looking photograph of Louis years later, as if taken for institutional records. If this theory is true, the children might have been absorbed into new families, told new names, given a manufactured past. Some may have grown up never knowing who they really were. Theory 3. A fire with a cover-up. A third theory doesn't require an international conspiracy or a trafficking ring, only incompetence, fear, and corruption. In this version, the fire really did kill the children. The lack of remains is explained by heat, structural collapse, and later disturbance of the site. The mysterious details, the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, are dismissed as coincidence, bad luck, or misremembered events. But even if the children died in the fire, this theory suggests that local authorities made serious mistakes and then tried to bury them. The rushed death certificates, the bulldozing of the site within days, the hostility toward any further inquiry, the planted adult bones, possibly placed there not by kidnappers, but by someone desperate to prove the official story and finally silence the family. In this reading, there is still a cover-up, but of negligence rather than a kidnapping plot. Officials might have feared lawsuits, reputational damage, or exposure of systemic failures, and chosen to let one family live with uncertainty rather than admit the truth. Theory 4. Something bigger. There are other theories, stranger and harder to prove. Some speculate that the children were taken into a secretive religious group, raised under new identities, cut off from the outside world. Others hint at government involvement, pointing to the FBI's odd disinterest in certain pieces of evidence and the threatening phone call to the private investigator. Each theory explains some parts of the puzzle and leaves others hanging. None fully accounts for the photograph of Louis, the threats, the planted bones, the years of carefully controlled silence, the legacy of not knowing. By the time the 21st century arrived, most of the people directly involved in the case were gone. George and Jenny were long buried. Several of the surviving children had passed away. Only a few, like Sylvia, remained to tell the story, worn but unchanged by time. They kept boxes of documents, old photographs, brittle newspaper clippings. They told the story to anyone who would listen, not because they expected a miracle, but because forgetting felt like a second death. In the end, the Sodder case became less about what happened on a single Christmas Eve, and more about the human cost of unanswered questions. 5 children vanished into fire and rumor. A mother and father spent the rest of their lives chasing shadows. A family grew up in the space between hope and grief, never able to fully live in either. And somewhere, buried in an unmarked file, an old letter, a forgotten confession, or a destroyed record, the truth may have existed once. Whether the Sodder children died in that house, were taken by criminals, or lived out their lives under other names, one fact remains. For the people who loved them, certainty never came. And sometimes, not knowing is the cruelest fate of all.